Hello, everyone. Today is Tuesday, July 31st, 2018, and this is the weekly meeting for Kubernetes Sig documentation. Let's start, as we always do, by asking if there are any new or first-time contributors here with us today.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes. Hello, welcome.
Hi, I'm Dhananjay Sathe. I work in India on a cloud robotics startup, and we use Kubernetes. And a couple of weeks back, I think Pooja and you, we got in touch on Twitter, and the main problem was around day two documentation about Kubernetes. So I wanted to know how to go about that, and so I decided to show up for this meeting. So hello, everybody. And
Great.
let me know when we can talk about it. So I'll talk then.
Great, thank you. The easiest way would be to message me on Kubernetes Slack. If you go to kubernetes.slack.com, that's the best way.
Yes, I'm aware.
Okay, excellent. It's great. Thank you for joining us. It's great to see you. Any other new or first-time contributors? I will say that I see Cody is back. I have not seen Cody for a year. Welcome back, Cody. Any other new folks? All right, then. So go ahead.
So I'm just joining the meeting here. I work with Dhananjay, and so just interested in the docs process. So we're just joining the SIG, and I'm Gautam. The username tag is wrong, but I don't know how to fix that. I am Gautam, and it's good to be in the meeting.
Welcome. We're glad you're here. All right. We have a fair amount of content to get through in today's meeting, so I'm going to suggest that we just start blazing through it. Let's see. Updates and reminders really quickly. So maintainers, please check the wiki for the PR Wrangler schedule through the end of the year, just to make sure that you know what your scheduled shift is. And if there are any conflicts there, let's try to resolve them early. Also, there's a PR open right now. It's Misty's PR open for better contribution guidelines. And there, I added a comment about roles and responsibilities at different levels of Kubernetes and Sig Docs membership. So maintainers particularly, if you could look at that comment and make sure that that looks accurate to you, because I'm almost certain that I've missed something, or that it's possible to have more precision about that topic, that would be awesome. Let's see, Luke, do you want to talk about Black Friday? Because I know that your thoughts have sort of evolved over a couple of weeks about that.
Well, yeah. So basically, I got in touch with Bjorn Peterson, who is at this point essentially the development lead on the Hugo project, and I kind of casually asked him if he would be opposed to something like a community contribution of a different Markdown engine for Hugo. For example, if somebody were to do like a Go port of Cramdown, as I think we had sort of talked about as a community a little bit.
Right.
And he basically said that he wouldn't be opposed to that in principle, but that apparently Black Friday 2 doesn't necessarily solve all of our problems, but seems to have some really interesting features that could help us out a lot. The issue is that apparently it's a lot of work to update Hugo to be able to use Black Friday 2. And he suggested that that maybe if we were willing to put resources like actual development engineering resource money into improving the Markdown situation, that it might be better to do it on the Black Friday version 2 upgrade side. So apparently that would get us a number of benefits, one of which would be that the table of contents issue that we've been having, where we're having trouble with the double bullets and things like that. So apparently in Black Friday version 2, you actually get a you don't just get this dot table of contents object that just kind of spits out unordered lists and list items as we currently have, but actually gives you a proper data structure that you can sort of iterate through and design however you'd like. And I haven't really explored this much yet, but apparently in Black Friday 2, there's a separation of the rendering phase. So you could hypothetically, we could hypothetically either create our own Markdown renderer for Hugo fairly easily, or we could update the existing one. I think that broadly the point is that porting Cramdown to Go would be tons and tons of effort, I think. And I'm not quite sure who either on our team or outside of it would be able to do that work. But it sounds like Bjorn, we could potentially, I don't know, throw him some money to do the Black Friday version 2 upgrade instead. I'm just throwing that out there as an idea. We don't need to come to any conclusions on that.
Okay, that's a good high-level overview. I am skeptical and would like to see more detail, but we can explore that, I guess, offline.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I can get in touch with him and get more information and maybe put together like an actual document or something like that. I just wanted to put this on people's radar.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for following up on that. Black Friday 1 has not been the rapturous transport of delight that we had hoped it might be. So it's good to know what possibilities are on the horizon and what it might take to get there. Zach Arnold is not here. He has a meeting conflict, but just a quick update on 1.12. Zach has done some really cool work on automating pieces of the release workflow, and they're tracking open PRs through Airtable. And I also know that that is fed with a GraphQL query from the GitHub API. So there's some really cool work happening in terms of visibility. Docs, the deadline for Docs PRs is 3 weeks away. I know that feature freeze for 1.12 is coming up here very shortly. So if you have not yet opened even just a shell PR for 1.12 Docs, now would be a great time to do it. Misty, how much time do you need to discuss Docs for reference maintenance releases by small number? If it's less than 5 minutes, is now a good time to do that?
Yeah, I don't need long. It's just basically a question. We have a few parts of our docs where we refer to the version by the maintenance release number, and those drift out of date and get updated sporadically. I'm wondering if we should maybe have a variable that we do keep up to date that is the maintenance version. I think we actually have that, but I think that we are terrible about keeping them up to date.
Yeah.
And it also needs to be kept up to date in prior releases that we still support, and we get maintenance releases for those all the time. So I just want to put it out there and see if either we want to commit to using the variables that we already have more consistently in the docs, or if somebody has a magical, more automated way to keep those up to date without manual work. Whatever we do, it does not scale to have like specific places in the docs where it's just a string that we have to find and replace. And these are commands that we're telling people to run. So the PR that I linked to, their solution in that PR, which I'm not super excited about, is just to replace the maintenance version number with .x and provide an admonition every single place that it's used, telling the person to replace .x with the version of Kubernetes that they're running. So it puts a lot of load on the user for something that it seems to me we should be able to somehow automate. So that's why I wanted to put it out there. I don't know what the right solution is.
Thank you for surfacing this. Yeah, it may be worth the time, even if it's just, even even if it's just finding, well, on an unrelated note, I'm looking for contractors for some specific pieces of work for Kubernetes docs, and sort of like having a handy person. It might be nice to just have a handy person to be like, hey, could you go through and replace every instance of this with a variable?
But there's a longer term thing that when Kubernetes has a point release, somebody needs to go and update the YAML files and all the supported branches of the docs to get those variables to be up to date. Like when there's a 1.10. whatever or 1.9. whatever, like those variables need, if we decide to use variables, then those variables need to be updated everywhere. The other question is, do we want to be referring to maintenance releases by a specific number at all? Or do we want to ask for some kind of mechanism like, some of it's using image versions, and do we just want to say we'll use :latest or something like that?
I mean, do we have to use like the maintenance version for something for the commands, or is like, why do we have it to that specificity?
I'm not sure. Maybe have a look at that PR and see, because I'm newer to the project. So
let's dive into that PR. Sorry, go ahead.
Would it be possible? Sorry, would it be possible to have like some sort of master variable list in like the main folders of Hugo for like templating? So the variable's not referenced in the file itself. The variable's like on like a master Hugo doc, for example. So if something changes, a version changes, updates, we update that one kind of central point, and then that changes all the variables.
yeah, we used something like that at Docker, actually. We had a JSON file that was in all the branches, but we only ever looked at the one in master. No matter what version it was rendering, we used it for navigation for what versions were supported, so effectively the same sort of thing. One problem with that is we're not on Hugo for all of our archives yet.
Yeah.
So that probably wouldn't scale until that happens, which I guess is going to be a year or something like that if we support 4 major versions.
Yeah.
Well, 9 months. We're getting closer. But it may be worthwhile. I mean, I understand that this is a problem that is backward-looking as well as forward-looking, but it may be worthwhile just to solve for forward-looking and let time resolve the rest. Or at least to limit that solely to Hugo versions, rather than try to solve for both. Let's dig into the PR and figure out what exactly we want to do. I mean, generally, it seems like a good idea to automate what we can, rather than impose another like particular maintenance burden, or at least to minimize that. If there is a file, like a YAML file that we have to update periodically, I would rather like have a quarterly or a whatever at whatever periodicity update just that one file rather than try and do more extensive maintenance every time that changes. So yeah, take a look at that PR. Let's comment, and from that see what we need to do, or what we can do, what we would like to do at a greater level of abstraction. All right. Let's see. What did I do? I appear to have done something. No, I appear to have done something about the discussion about branching strategy for repositories, for localization repositories. So in last week's weekly meeting at the APAC time, one of the localization leads asked whether we had already solved for branching strategy, what branching strategy for localization repos should look like, and we hadn't. We have not gotten that far. partly because the question hasn't come up yet to that degree of specificity, and partly because I don't know. I'm honestly unsure of how much of our workflow to export to a localization team. So rather than solve for all of it, what I would like to do is just put the idea into people's minds to think about what looks like a minimum viable product for exporting or for expectations for branching strategy for localization repos. Seems to me at a minimum there has to be a branch for each Kubernetes release, each major release. There has to be a working branch, and there has to be at least one branch that we can identify, that we can automate with GitHub webhooks to import that content into K website whenever that version or whenever that branch is updated. So at a minimum, that's looking like current +4, so that's 5 release branches, a working branch, and a snapshot branch, I guess, if you want to call it that. I would ask that let's think about this some more, and let's pick this back up again next week, and review it once we've had a little bit more time to consider what a good branching model looks like. Okay. Note. All right. Neha and Andrew, if you would like to talk about improvements to site UX, is that something? Do you want to do that today?
Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
Let me share my screen. I think it's this one, right? Yeah.
Present.
Yeah, where's the present button?
It's over here. Yeah, it's there.
Oh, great. Okay.
Okay, so this is my internship project, and the goal of my internship project was to help novice users of Kubernetes onboard faster and improve their experience with our documentation. And for this, I basically used 4 methods. The needs assessment phase was interviews and competitive analysis. In interviews, I basically interviewed I didn't get too many users, but I got 2 interns who were interning in the Kubernetes team. So I asked them how they onboarded with the product, and they did not have a prior experience working with Kubernetes, so they were novice users. And in competitive analysis, I analyzed 4 competitors. One was Docker, which is kind of our direct competitor because it operates in the similar space. Then I also looked at Coursera courses for introductory programming and Stripe documentation because it's really valued well by the developers. And then I also looked at Kubernetes tutorials on Udemy for and just to know how tutorials are basically onboarding the new users. And then I did heuristics evaluation and usability testing with our current documentation to find the problems with the documentation. I'll explain a little bit about heuristics evaluation. So heuristics evaluation is generally done for user interfaces, and Nielsen has given 10 heuristics, but I could use only 5 of them in our documentation, and I added another one, which was information architecture, and I came up with questions which are based on best practices for documentation and common sense. So the questions were does the content anticipate users' next task and prompts them in the right direction? Do the links in documentation lead to content that meets user expectations? And so I had around 30 questions, and I laid out 3 tasks, and then just figured out how the severity of each question is linked to those tasks. And in the usability testing, I did usability testing with 3 users who were again novice users of Kubernetes. Some of them had like little experience with Docker, but not really much. And I just wanted to get their feedback around our homepage, some of the Kubernetes basic tutorials and interactive tutorials on commands, which uses kube control. So the main findings from like all these UX studies were users want diagrams, but the current diagrams are not very useful. And this came across in interviews as well as in usability tests, where in interviews people said that they want diagrams so that they could have like better mental models. And usability tests, they said that the current diagrams are not very helpful, like they couldn't read what's in the diagram. They did not make sense of why the shapes were as they were in the diagrams. They did not understand why things are not connected to each other. And they said that there is kubelet, but I can't see kubelet in the diagram because readability was so poor. So we need to improve diagrams. And then in interviews, one of the user told me that it's not just important for me to understand one concept, but I should also be able to make a distinction between 2 concepts. And this was kind of validated in my usability test when a user could not understand why a pod is different from container or why Kubernetes needs both the things. And the other one was we have too many links that are not really helpful. For example, in the Kubernetes basics section, we have a Docker link which just takes you to the Docker website, not even like a Docker definition or something. And there's a Minikube link that takes you to the GitHub page where people just scroll down to the README section and then they read a sentence about what Minikube is. And if they come back to the page, then again they can read that sentence which is on the GitHub page. So it's not really meaningful. So we need to like audit all the links that we have and see they're adding value to the customers. And also we need to like figure if we are giving them good recommendations at the end of each topic so that they know like where they need to go, because novice users do not really know what they need to learn initially. And there was, we were going through one interactive tutorial, and so they, like, I was asking them, so just explain me what this command does. And at this one place where people were deploying pods, they were like, okay, I've deployed a pod, but I don't know what a pod is because we did not introduce them to a pod. So that was in the next topic. And there was, we didn't even add one line of definition to like explain what a pod is. So users were really confused about that. And we had like a user persona page, which was like this, where they could basically take a journey and follow the path that they could, you know, relate to. So I told them they are application developers, but none of the users interacted with the website as we thought they would. So they just went to the tabs that were there, documentation, concepts tab, tutorial tabs, because that is what they're used to. And that is how they interact with the documentation websites. So we probably need to pull this out and lay out the options more clearly, like maybe add like a getting started section. There are other findings that would improve the usability of documentations. These are mostly from the competitive analysis. Like Docker documentation has like a recap section of all the commands that they go through. So I think that is really meaningful. We could add it, and so that users can easily access the commands that they have went through. Then we should have like a clear call to action on the home page so that users know we have to just click here, like a getting started section. And in interactive tutorials, I also found that the chunking was a problem. Like people could not find the information that they were looking for. So we probably need to chunk the commands a little bit better and improve the information architecture there. Yeah, these are like the examples from Docker. And yeah. And Coursera tutorials have like small quizzes. So in the video tutorial, the uh, teacher would basically introduce a concept, and then there would be there would be a break where they would just ask you to, go through a small quiz, which you can do in maybe like 10-15 seconds. So that's really helpful. We can maybe add it in interactive tutorials. And then,
yeah, because right now, like, all the tutorials are sort of like copy paste, and we need to sort of challenge the user so that it'll help solidify their understanding. Because right now they're just like copy paste and not retain much.
yeah. And in Stripe, documentation gives like a very customized experience, and like in the getting started section itself, they kind of give users the incentive to log in. Once they create a login, then they can basically have a customized code, like commands for themselves, which they can just copy paste and like run on their console. So we can probably do something similar. And the tutorials in Udemy, they basically allow you to bookmark the content on the video, so users, like other users, know that this was the useful information for most other users who had went through those tutorials. And it also gives us feedback about which sort of information people are finding valuable. And in Docker, as well as like Udemy and Coursera, they have like this they have this thing where they show like display this much time is required to do a task. So you can know like it'll take me 5 minutes to go through this video. Okay, yeah.
There.
And I also found that like the information that was on the right side of the page was basically ignored by the users. They were not reading it, and even though we had put it like in a highlighted form and we wanted them to, find the most concise information on the and most important information on the right side, but none of the users were actually looking at it. So maybe we should pull that out and like put it in like the main section and highlight it there. And we were also thinking of having like a non-install environment sort of a thing, where they can have like an embedded console and they can run the commands. Right now, the interactive tutorials are very restrictive, like you can only do the commands that are there in the interactive tutorials. But if we are going to add some quizzes, and if we are going to add like, if we want them to, play around with the console and like commands, so we can just give them like a Katacoda console. Yeah.
So we talked with Ben Hall, and Katacoda has like sort of a version that you can put a button on the page, and when you click on it, it loads like a Minikube environment in a panel at the bottom of the page. So you can continue to scroll through the documentation, read it, and then actually do stuff in the console.
And yeah, last, we can have like a feedback section. Most of the tutorials and documentation has this feedback section where people can say like if they like this page or what other comments they can have about the page, so that it'll help us improve the documentation. And the limitations of the study were I had very limited number of participants, and I had to only depend on my heuristics evaluation. Generally, you ask like a couple of people to do heuristics and include their findings as well, but the level of detail was missing, so I had to just depend on mine. And I reviewed very limited number of doc sets, and I also looked at like only 4 competitors. And this is like my I'll take any questions you guys have.
Does anyone have any questions?
I have many, but I'm also mindful that we have 2 other presentations to get to in the time that we have left. Neha, thank you so much for your presentation and for putting all of this information together. For, I guess, one question, if you can in 3 minutes or less, what would you say is how would you summarize the primary calls to action? What are the 3 most important ways in which we can improve Kubernetes documentation?
I think I kind of put the most important 5 findings that I think are most impactful in the beginning, like improving the links, like having better diagrams, because it's so complicated that, and like users were like, I'm so lazy, I don't want to read all this content, and I was so happy to see a diagram, but this diagram is so useless that like it just doesn't convey anything. So I think good diagrams are definitely like a big plus. And some of the places people were reading and they thought that they understood, but they did not really understand. So we need to like differentiate between the concepts really well, maybe by adding examples. And they were pretty fine with the length of the documentation. Like I didn't find any user who was like, oh my God, this is like so much information. They were basically reading through most of the content. Yeah, but given a choice, I think if the diagrams could convey things better, they would like depend on them more. And we definitely need to sort our links, because I didn't find any of the links really useful, even in my heuristics evaluation. Yeah.
Neha, if folks have questions for you after this meeting, what is the best way for them to contact you?
Email me, I can answer them. I can also share the reports, like which should be over by next week. And yeah, you can have like a look at the detailed study, because this is like very concise presentation. I had like more findings, but I didn't put them here.
So Neha or Andrew, may I ask for you to put contact information, or like the best summary of the best way to contact in the meeting notes, please?
Yeah. Unfortunately, Neha's last week here as an intern is next week. So I'm not sure if we can forward her Google email address, but I will find a way to so we can stay in touch.
They can have my University of Michigan email ID. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
Sounds good. All right. Do we want to do the FMC one next?
Yes, let's do.
Okay, so first let me introduce Dominic Tornow. He's the Director of Engineering at SAP. Dominic, you want to say hi?
Hi, good morning. Nice to meet everybody.
So just to give a little background, this all came from conversations that Dominic and I know each other from the dog park, and when he found out I was a tech writer for Kubernetes, he started asking me all these questions, like specifically about the behavior, and I realized I couldn't answer a lot of his questions, right? So this got into about like, how do we build better mental models for our users so that they understand like not just the general architecture, but like the behavior of the Kubernetes system and like definitions of things. So let me share my screen here. Okay. And Neha also helped out with this as well. Okay, so the whole idea is to help Kubernetes users, particularly novices as well, like build better mental models, right? So if you ask people like what their experience of learning Kubernetes is, like the universal answer that I've come across is that Kubernetes is a beast. That's what everyone says, right? It's complex and there's a lot of things to learn. And if you look at our documentation, it's very usage-centric, right? We're very task-oriented. We probably focus on like how to do specific tasks, and we have tutorials. But the underlying concepts are only really sort of on a need-to-know basis. And like in the concepts that we do talk about, they're a lot of times incomplete or inaccurate. And then it's also hard to reason about Kubernetes, like what it's actually doing, right? For example, like, what is a pod? Like this came up in Neha's research as well. Like, and what does it do, right? Like in our documentation, we say it's the smallest deployable object in the Kubernetes, object model. But like, what are we talking about by Kubernetes objects? And what's the object model? Because we never really specify what that is. And what does the term deployable refer to? so all this is kind of confusing, and actually, like, depending on what your definition of deployable is, probably the pod is the only thing that's deployable in the Kubernetes, world, right? And so perhaps a more accurate description would be pod is a representation of a request to execute one or more containers on the same node, And so you can take a look also at there's a GitHub issue where from the KK repo where somebody's asking, how does the pod actually behave in this scenario? And Janet does a great job explaining it, but she has to point to like specific lines in the Kubernetes code to illustrate what the behavior is going to be. And that's not really ideal. And so it kind of highlights that the user's mental model is not sort of aligned with the actual behavior of Kubernetes. So what we want to do is I think we must convey a clear mental model of Kubernetes. And so where Dominic comes in is he is trained in FMC, which is fundamental modeling concepts. So to give you a quick kind of history of that, it was originally developed in 1975. And the idea is to address like the communication issues in the software industry, specifically like the discrepancy between like what is meant and what is expressed, or like information that is not explicitly shared. Because we encounter this a lot in Kubernetes. Like new users often have to ask like seasoned users for specific details, but none of that's captured in documentation. It's like just talk, one-on-one conversations, things like that. So we want to capture that information and convey it through our documentation. So FMC, was developed since then, and it's been used at Siemens and SAP consistently, and then eventually turned into the Apache Modeling Project, which is hosted by the Hasso-Plattner Institute. And in SAP right now, it's also known as like TAM, Technical Architectural Models, and you can visit the site if you want to know more detailed information. But the important things are that it has different types of diagrams to explain different aspects of the system, right? Because right now you may see some Kubernetes just sort of general architecture diagrams, but they don't really tell you how things function. So like, FMC also has structure diagrams to show you how things are connected. But there are also behavior diagrams that talk about like, the flow of the system and the behavior. And then there are also entity relationship diagrams, so you can understand better like what are the different pieces in the system and how they interact, what their relationships are, right? So for example, like a quick one that Dominic did to illustrate this for me is like for Node, right? So we talk about Node and we have these architecture diagrams that show the control plane and kubelet, but it's like, how does it actually function, right? So like in this diagram, you can see it's much more clear, right? So the kubelet controls the node, and it takes like, and so then the images are like put through the container runtime and instantiated, and they're executed as containers. So this like, in a simple diagram, explains a lot more about the behavior. And I want to just note that Misty, always tells me and make sure that we don't rely too much on diagrams, which I totally agree with. But I think these will also help us as technical writers understand the system better so that we can give more concise and accurate descriptions. So I don't want to say that we're necessarily relying on diagrams, but I think it should help all of our understanding so then we can improve the documentation.
I think the other thing, just real quick to jump in, different people learn in different models, and
Right.
Some people learn really well from textual description, but there are a group of us that the pictures like this are hugely helpful.
Hey, Brad, I'm sorry. I'm going to lightly moderate and ask that we hold questions and comments till the end, please.
Okay. So basically, our proposal is we want to have like a dedicated project to create some FMC documentation. So we want to convey the essence of Kubernetes and like how it behaves, and minimize the dependency on source code for people to understand what Kubernetes does, and replace ambiguous language with accurate models, right? Because when we say like node or cluster or pod or whatever, it's a lot of times people aren't talking about the same thing. And then we want to create a set of diagrams with explanations to help users, both novice and more advanced users, build a more robust and accurate mental model of how Kubernetes works. And then in general, we also want Kubernetes.io to be the canonical source of core concepts and terms, so people link to us and not have to kind of try to re-describe it in their own terms. And so for non-goals, we're not making like fancy diagrams for marketing materials or any of that. We're not creating specification diagrams. And we're helping users build better mental models, but we're not telling them how to architect their app or build their app, right? So what we're looking for is, so for this to be like a contract project, so we're looking for some funding because Dominic needs some dedicated time to do this since it's not within the scope of his regular job. So he would contract for us. And then he needs access to engineers to sort of ask questions, discover like, and understand the behavior, and then like validate the models that he comes up with. And then, a tech writer to work with him to wordsmith any of the, company explanations and documentation, right? The general process of the project is, first we're proposing just limit the scope to just pods for now, just as like a, first iteration to see how things go. And then there's like a discovery phase, which is just getting a general understanding of the system, and talking to the engineers. There's model creation, and then finding the gaps in that and refining that, and then rinse and repeat until we converge on a stable and validated model that everyone agrees on and it makes sense, right? So these are the project deliverables, the diagrams, the definition, and the explanations. And then people often ask, like, how do we test the effectiveness of this? So if we limit the scope to the pod pages, right, we can use the metrics that we've been gathering as the baseline now, and then check on the page views and the time on page for those to see. They should increase if these are effective. Also, we're separately working on being able to deploy page satisfaction surveys. And so if we can do that and deploy them on like the pods pages, we can get more direct feedback to see if these are effective for the people reading that documentation. So that's mostly it. So Dominic here is here to help answer some questions too. So if you have any questions.
I see that Misty has a comment or a question in the comments in chat. What would the deliverables be? Would it be SVGs, and how would we maintain it?
Yeah, Dominic, which tool are the diagrams created in?
So currently I'm using OmniGraffle, but there is no dedicated tool support. The diagrams are simple. All three diagrams consist of rectangular boxes, rounded rectangular boxes, and circles line in between them. So for the technical representation of the diagram, SVG is probably a good choice. PNG might be another. I do not know about the setup of the Kubernetes documentation, what is most beneficial.
Yes. Our general standard is to use SVGs, and yeah, OmniGraffle definitely creates them, so I think we can stick with that.
But we would have access to the source as well.
Yeah, so we should take the source files and store them in the repo.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. I didn't know how that relationship is going to be set up.
We haven't done that yet with the previous things, but I think that's what we should go to.
Now, maintenance, the question is what you refer to maintenance. So maintenance of the accuracy of the information that is conveyed in the diagrams. So diagrams are usually leveled, and the further you go down, the more detail you add. I personally would definitely suggest very high level diagrams and then go down a few steps, as long as you are in the realm of implementation independent concepts. So for example, the pod is a strong concept within Kubernetes, first-class concept that is unlikely to change unless Kubernetes itself changes significantly. So if you model the pod, its dependencies, its life cycle, and how it goes through Kubernetes, your information is probably up to date for a, I want to say, fairly long period of time. But of course, it is correct if there are any groundbreaking changes within Kubernetes, and also that information conveyed in the diagrams is obsolete. But since it is not, we're not talking on a code level, right? We're not trying to explain the code. We're trying to explain the system. So what I like to say is that code breathes life into an application in the machine, whereas models breathe life into the application in the heads of people. So that is what we're trying to do, and that is fairly far removed from a code level. So with a few lines of code changing, the models will not change.
Any other questions?
I think we're out of time.
Yeah.
I have several, but I want to leave room for others to ask before I dive in.
I mean, I just have more of a comment, as I was saying before, and I tried to get it in quickly. I think, you know, the visuals are very helpful to me, and I think there's a group of people where the visuals are great. I think it'll be interesting when he does the pod to see, you know, some of us know a whole bunch about pods and their characteristics. I think the interesting thing will be how much does the model capture about the pod. You know, hey, each pod gets an IP address. You know, how do you capture the fact that, you know, two containers in the pod can communicate via normal IPC, for example. So there's a lot of neat characteristics about pods, and I think that'll be the interesting to see how we capture it in the model, to capture all those behavioral characteristics that you learn kind of sort of on the streets.
So in case it is a question or it invites further comments, let me just comment on that. So we were briefly touching on a model relationship that is refinement, where you have a higher level model, you have a lower level model, and they're a lower level model. That is the relationship between models of refinement. What you just described is an invitation to also talk about the other relationship between models, that is aspect. So whereas you can think of refinement from top to bottom, aspect reaches out a little bit to the left and the right. So if there is, for example, for the first phase, particular interest in how does the pod do networking, right? Then that is definitely an invitation for an aspect where we talk about pods in the context of networking. And these are information that you would probably omit in other diagrams when you talk about life cycle of a pod, right? They do have some touch points because obviously when the pods are created, then the networks are set up. But when we talk about the phases of the pod, like unbound, bound, pending, running, succeeded, failed, then probably when we go through these life cycles, the networking is a detail that for understanding the life cycle is not necessary within that model. So in order to describe one concept, there are multiple models around it. Some are refinement, some are aspects. And it very much depends on the audience and also the time frame, which relationships between the models you traverse and how much detail you actually add. But that is also something that can be added over time, just to say.
So for the pilot that you're discussing, I guess the proposal would be confined to the concept of the pod.
Yeah, in the pod documentation, because when we're looking at this, it's like Kubernetes is huge, and like, you know, how do we scope this out? Right. So we figured that's a key area to start with because everyone wants to know about the pod, and it's such an important concept.
Sure. Right. So obviously, I mean, diagrams would be part of the deliverable, but another thing that you mentioned is the accompanying text. So I guess my question would be, what content is this augmenting? Is this replacing content? Are you proposing, which I want to make clear that I am perfectly fine replacing our content with better content, but I want to have a clearer idea of where this content would live, what it would either add to or replace in the context of our documentation model right now.
So there's sort of a pod overview, a pod section in our concept area, and I think it would be, I would describe as a refactor, right? So anything that is confusing, we would kind of get rid of and replace with more clear things. If there's some things that are accurate and good, then we'll keep them. But I think of it as a refactor.
So it's you are proposing refactoring pod documentation and adding better diagrams, better models, better right. Diagrams and models.
Yeah, and also, I mean, some of these diagrams may end up in other parts of documentation as well, but I imagine that's where most of them will start, at least.
And also, if you don't mind me adding that, So FMC is not only about the diagrams. Of course, that is what is most visual because they are visuals. However, it is also a commitment to clear terminology and definitions. So hunting down definitions actually does take a while. So Andrew and I circled a long time over, for example, the definition of what is a pod and what does it do, right? And these definitions, if you look at the current definition and some of the explanations in the Kubernetes documentation, they certainly do describe certain aspects, but the definition of a pod does not capture what the essence of the pod really is.
Just so. So I guess in a follow-up question would be, Andrew, as you note, Kubernetes is huge. So say that this is a wild success, defining a pod better, giving a better definition of a pod, adding better diagrams, say that we love it, we laughed, we cried, it's better than cats, amazing. How do we sustain that to other concepts? Because Kubernetes is huge. Like what happens then?
That's a good question. I think at that point, we'll need to identify what are the core concepts that need to be modeled like this, because not everything needs to be done, especially since we're moving to sort of like a more add-in or like extension model for Kubernetes. But like the core of Kubernetes, I think, needs to be done, so we can, I think, limit the scope to that. But in terms of, but I'm not sure how much work that is yet. I mean, that's part of what this pilot is, to see like how much time does it take, like how hard is this to do for Kubernetes?
Yeah, part of me, I need to think that through before that falls out of my mouth.
We don't have to decide anything today at this moment. It was just
sure.
The conversation.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question is, what is the follow-up? What needs to happen next? What's the next step here?
Well, I think Sig Docs has to decide whether this is something we want to pursue or not, and then we can work out the details of what the project is, specifically.
Sure.
Just one thought, Zach. You totally read my mind with your question about how does this integrate more seamlessly with the text, and how do you have like one active communication that combines the text and the visual. And something that comes to mind with this is, could this method be used at a slightly higher level of abstraction within the Kubernetes system? So this is like slightly lower level, looking at one aspect, looking at the pod. But could this be used in a higher level overview that describes the interaction of, what are, clusters, pods, nodes, et cetera, in the higher level, like what is Kubernetes page? And would that maybe be a different place to apply it in the beginning to see if it works? I realize that's maybe a little bit more complex, but it seems from what you've said that the same methodology could be used at the system level rather than at the pod level, and that might be, that just struck me as being another place to test it, to pilot it.
Absolutely, that is definitely a possibility. So we picked the pod because it is a very prominent concept within Kubernetes, and also the core concept that actually brings containers to life. However, we could absolutely look into modeling Kubernetes as a cluster of nodes, what makes up that cluster, what is a Kubernetes application to begin with, how are the applications managed, how does the control loop actually work, and what does the control loop affect. You would then probably have to look at what was called in the documentation the Kubernetes object model, talk about the API server, the individual controllers talk to the API server to transform the current state into the desired state. However, it is actually an interesting point to start, because it's commonly known that Kubernetes Kubernetes works towards transforming the current state into the desired state, right? But only after I created some of the models, some of the sketches, I actually realized that this is a multi-step process. So for example, you have the deployment set and the replica set, sorry. You have the replica set, and the desired state of the replica set is just, well, there should be 3 pods. Then the thing is done, right? But now the scheduler comes up and says, well, there are 3 pods. My desired state is all 3 of them are bound. All right, I'm done, right? And then the kubelets come into play and said, hey, there is a pod and I'm not executing that, so I have to do this, right? So it's kind of like a waterfall model of many control loops. That was something that I did not have a clear picture of that in mind. Once you actually sketch that as a diagram, it is, boom, interesting. Yeah? And then you see the control loop everywhere. Kubelet controller, schedule is a controller. The controller is a controller. So
Dominic, I'm so sorry. I'm going to moderate lightly just for time because we're rapidly approaching the end of our scheduled time. I am sorry to interrupt because this is so fascinating, and I will say that I personally am interested to see where this project goes. But on a non-binding vote basis, just as folks have listened to this, are folks interested in exploring this concept further? Just, you know, up, down, yes, no. Is anybody not interested? Thinks this is totally the wrong way to go? If you are downvoting, your screen is turned off, which very good. So that's pretty unanimous and strong interest. Dominic, would you be willing to come back again next week to discuss this? I don't know what your schedule is like, but would you be willing to come back next week and talk a little more?
You guys are always meeting Tuesday, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Double check real quick. Yes, that is looking good.
Great. Yes, we would like to invite you back and have a little bit more time to talk specifically about moving forward, because yeah, this is very intriguing, and I'm really glad that you came and spoke with us today. Yeah, this is it. I think you have touched on one of the great deficiencies of Kubernetes documentation as it exists right now, which is that the mental model of it is very hard to get around. Excellent. Neha, thank you very much. Thank you for devoting your time for your internship to analyzing our user experience and providing such concrete suggestions for how we can improve documentation. Thank you.
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Neha.
And we look forward to implementing and moving forward with your suggestions. Sorry. Andrew and Dominic, thank you very much for talking about FMC. This has been really, really cool, and I think we're really excited to talk about it again next week and figure out how to move forward. So we're at the end of our time. I know that we talked about a lot of stuff today. So if there are questions or follow-up conversations to be had, Slack is available. Let's keep the conversation going in Slack, in Sig Docs. Is there and just really quick follow-up from anyone before we end the call? All right.
I had
Thanks, everyone. Again, go ahead.
Hey, so I wanted to talk about the day 2 documentation that Kubernetes has. I think I'll get in touch with you on Slack and probably show up for the next meeting. Basically, the cluster operator documentation that we have currently, we found we have some comments about that. So I wanted to sort of figure out if this is the right forum, and is there sort of a focus on that whole aspect of it?
Yeah, let's talk more in Slack, but I think if you want to have a community forum and a community discussion about cluster operator docs, the best way is to get it on the agenda, and then we'll have this kind of round robin discussion that we do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is definitely the right place for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Cool.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your week. Take care.
Well.